Professor Robert Gutmann is an old friend of this house. He came to this house even before I was a student here in the 90s, invited by Luciano Coutinho. Many of you know him. And he is in the same tradition of combining the critical authors in different perspectives. And then he converted to a very interesting school in France, which is the School of Regulation, but it's not regulation in the English sense. He can maybe tell you a little bit about that. École de Régulation. And then he will teach in the whole morning. We will divide the session into 2 sessions. In the first part, he will talk about a book he is now writing, so you have the privilege of knowing the book beforehand. War or Reform, the title is amazing. And then in the second part, he will talk about innovation policy in both Europe and the US. Professor Robert was my professor in Paris 13, Université Sorbonne Paris Nord, back in 15 years ago. And then since then, we started exchanging ideas. He was part of my jury, and then we meet, if not annually, every 2 years to discuss our works. And he comes frequently to Campinas. He's now retired in France, but he's teaching at Hofstra University in the US. Okay, so Robert, it's a great pleasure and honor for us to have you here. Thank you very much.
So yes, I was supposed to talk about the science and technology innovation regimes of the US as well as the European Union, which I will do in the second session. In the first session, I will try to give you a broader context in which to place the question of technology today. And that context is actually a book I'm writing right now. It's a follow-up on a trilogy on capitalism that I wrote earlier, called Finance-Led Capitalism, Eco-Capitalism, and Multipolar Capitalism. By the way, if you ever wanted any of the copies of these 3 books, finding my work interesting enough, then please just send me an email and I'll send you whatever you want me to send you, okay? I do believe in free circulation of information. And my publisher has allowed me to do that, so, you know. But anyway, so I think that it's important for us to contextualize the current moment because it's a transformative moment. It's transformative because we're facing at the same time a socio-ecological transition, which we have never done before. It's like building an ocean liner while being on an ocean liner and then transferring everything from one ocean liner to the other. But we're doing that while at the same time facing intensifying domestic political polarization pretty much everywhere in the world, and also mounting geopolitical tensions between power centers, and at the same time also facing profound technological change. That's a lot. And this combination affects, I think already, but probably progressively more so in the near future, the relationship between humans and humans. But given the nature of technological change today, also the relationship between humans and machines, and given our climate crisis, also the relationship between humans and nature. And so we are facing a moment where what we're going to do going forward has an incredible repercussion for the future of the planet and the future for our species. And so I thought it's important to give this particular moment, which is a transformative moment for all the reasons I just explained, a broader context, kind of a historic context, to see whether we can make better decisions knowing what has already happened to us in the past. Right? And so I'm going to ground this in an approach which Bruno briefly mentioned, which is la théorie de la régulation, which I wanted to explain to you in the next 2 slides. So, la théorie de la régulation, the French word of régulation has nothing to do with the English word of regulation. Regulation is basically looking at a complex system in forward motion and how it balances itself in terms of reproducing itself over time and space, right? And this was originally, focused on explaining the post-war boom, which the regulation is called the Fordist regime, a regime of mass production and mass consumption, and then studying its particular crisis, which was a unique crisis starting in the late 60s, the stagflation crisis, right? So originally, la théorie de la régulation, its founders, Michel Alieta and Robert Boyer, they were just looking at a particular period, right? But subsequent authors, of which I'm one, there's a second generation of authors, Dominique Plion, Jacques Mazier, Benjamin Correa, and I would add my own name to it, Robert Gutmann. We tried to expand this theory a bit more and make it a theory of long waves. We have lots of arguments over that, and it's still not clear to what extent it is actually a theory of long waves, but that's an internal discussion I can explain to you more later. I became interested in long waves when I was a second-year student in the University of Vienna in Austria. I'm originally Austrian, where I listened to a guy called Ernest Mandel, who's a Marxist, and he was kind of laying out his work in the theory of long waves, which was a theory of the decline of the profit rate and then the reorganization of capitalism as a counter-tendency to the decline of profit rates, right? And I was 19 years old. This was in 1970. It blew my mind. And then I got obsessed with that, right? One of the themes that I've been working on now for over 50 years. And what's interesting about this is that it allows you, it gives you the opportunity, the possibility of having a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach to history, the history of your economic system, the history of capitalism, right? And there's so many different interesting tendencies to identify, right? So, but right now, what I want to just do at this point, because I don't think you're necessarily familiar with all that stuff, I want to give you a kind of a glossary of the key concepts. And these are concepts I'm going to use throughout my my second conversation, right? So the key concept, there's two key concepts in regulation, École de régulation, which is accumulation regime and mode of regulation, right? So the accumulation regime is basically, in the simplest way, a particular chapter in the history of capitalism. So you can say post-war capitalism was a Fordist regime. Then subsequently, we have a finance-led capitalism regime, which is between, let's say, the 1980s and 2008. And now we're going to get into kind of an ecologically oriented regime, right, which I call eco-capitalism. Right? So you can periodize the history of capitalism in successive accumulation regimes, right? And that's how you can also then look at long waves. You can look at long waves. Long waves are a concept that came with Nikolai Kondratiev in the 1920s, famous Soviet economist, who, because of course, at that point, finding out that capitalism has a capacity not to collapse, but to reorganize itself, it was a death sentence, literally, right? Stalin killed him in 1938. But Kondratiev worked incredibly fast and incredibly concentrated in an institute that he founded in the 20s. And so he published actually a remarkable amount of work in a very short period of time about this. And but he didn't explain why. He just looked at various long-term data to see these long-term fluctuations, both in terms of prices and in terms of production data, right? He suspected that it was technologically driven. And this was then taken up by Joseph Schumpeter, another Austrian economist, in 1939, writing a famous book called Business Cycles, in which he kind of revived or rediscovered Kondratiev waves, which he called Kondratiev waves, right? He has all kinds of other business cycles, like the juggler wave, the Kuznets, and there's different waves, right? But the Kondratiev is the long wave, and Schumpeter then elaborated on the technological dimension of long waves. Right? After the war, it gained a financial dimension, okay, which is Hyman Minsky. The early work of Hyman Minsky, in particular, an article in 1964 in American Economic Review, looks at the long-term financial evolution or development, and it's a long wave development according to Minsky. Then, of course, Mandel's work this was in 1960. Mardel's work is in the late 60s, 70s. It's Marxist. It has to do with the tendency of the profit rate to fall and the counter tendencies. And then in the late 70s, you get a more complete version of long wave theory with the Théorie de la Régulation, especially Alita's book in 1976, which is his thesis on the US economy, which is a fantastic book I recommend that you read, right? What's at the essence of accumulation regimes, which is how the regulation theory sort of thinks about these long waves. Each long wave corresponds to a particular accumulation regime, is the so-called mode of regulation, la mode de la régulation. Each accumulation regime has its own mode of regulation. And what we mean by mode of regulation is the interaction, the coherence, the coherent interaction between the different institutional pillars of a particular accumulation regime. Right? So you can break down the accumulation regime in specific institutional pillars. Typically, the institutional pillars relate to the wage-labor nexus, types of competition between firms, the nature of the state and the state intervention in the economy, money and banking, and fifthly, the international dimension, which gets organized around the international monetary system. Okay. And so these 5 institutional pillars, which kind of comprise the essence of capitalism, they interact in particular fashion, specifically for each accumulation regime, right? So you can, when you specifically analyze Fordism or you analyze finance-led capitalism, as I did in the book Finance-Led Capitalism, you go through this elaboration of interaction and coherence between these different institutional pillars that give you the mode of regulation. So my own contribution has been focusing on how we go from one accumulation regime to another. Okay. Because that's been an unresolved question. And it's an unresolved question in Schumpeter, it's an unresolved question in Minsky, it's an unresolved question in Mandel. It's an unresolved question among the regulationists. Okay. Regulationists can very well explain an accumulation regime and how it works. They can also explain how it disintegrates, but they cannot explain how we go from one to the next. Okay. And my argument is that when you look at the history of capitalism and you look at the history of accumulation regimes, evolving capitalism, the transition has always been one between war or reform. It's always one of reform, but sometimes reform happens before the war, without a war, like in the 1980s, and sometimes, more often actually, it only happens with war, after the war. The war creates the condition for reform. And so, and I'm trying to use that particular realization to basically frame today, right? Because I think very much today, we're exactly at that point where we have to make choices between war or reform. Right? That's the key argument here, right? And in order to understand this better, to give it a kind of a theoretical nuance, I also have additional concepts that are crucial that I'm trying to elaborate in this book, right? That I'm wanting to elaborate for a long time, and now I'm finally getting to this, right? And one is to have a typology of crisis, right? Because, I mean, what is key here to this whole history, why I think regulation theory is so interesting, is that you get this sense of structural crisis. It's a theory of structural crisis. And by structural crisis, we're talking about processes of disintegration and recomposition that change the nature of capitalism. And they change the nature of capitalism, in my view, in terms of moving you, through a disintegration process of an existing accumulation regime into a process where you're building a new accumulation regime. Right? That's the job of the structural crisis. And I'll talk more about that later, right? But in that context, it becomes important to understand that there's different levels of structural crisis. Most of the time we have serious crises, they're structural crises. Structural crises are by definition serious because they disintegrate things. But most of them are relatively manageable. Okay, they're what we call, what I would classify as a structural crisis on the level of a crisis of the mode of regulation. That means that the existing accumulation regime with its mode of regulation has something that breaks down that process of self-regulation, and then you have a crisis. Right? For example, right, at the essence of Fordism, at the essence of the boom in the 50s and 60s, was a balance between real wage growth and productivity gains, as crystallized in the agreement between General Motors and United Automobile Workers in 1948, which then became a global standard of how you regulate this wage and productivity balance. That wage and productivity balance broke down in the late 60s at the essence of the stagflation crisis, at the beginning of the stagflation. It's the universal unregulated banking system that emerges from the late 70s, in a long story that I can talk to you about a lot, but I analyzed very well, I think, in Financial Capitalism. And it becomes a crisis of universal banking. Right? The crisis of 2007, 2008 is a very specific financial crisis, right? And it's the crisis of how the financial system used to work and doesn't work anymore because of changes that have to do with shadow banking and the regulatory dialectic between finance and the government. Right? I'm not going to go into details. I'm just trying to make a point. I'm trying to make a point that you get frequently structural crises that are crises of the mode of regulation. And because the crisis of mode of regulation, the accumulation regime will eventually change. But you have deeper crises than that. For example, the crisis of the interwar period between World War I and World War II was a crisis of the accumulation regime. You had to change capitalism quite profoundly to get out of it, and you could only do this after World War II. I would suspect, and this is the point I'm making, and this is why this typology of crisis is so important to me, is that we are already in a crisis of the accumulation regime. To me, the climate crisis is a crisis of the accumulation regime. It is a crisis that affects all aspects of capitalism. And we will need to change a lot. We will need to change how we eat. We will need to change how we build. We will need to change how we drive. I mean, it's a very profound crisis. And it also is a crisis of the accumulation regime because it's open-ended and cumulative. It only gets worse. Okay? This is a completely different type of crisis than what we used to. Okay? You understand that, right? Then we've had, in the past, occasionally, crisis of the mode of production, where the entire system falls apart. Feudalism fell apart. Merchant capitalism fell apart. Soviet-style communism fell apart. These are all crises of the mode of production. If we don't deal with the climate crisis, which is already a crisis of the accumulation regime, sufficiently early and sufficiently comprehensively, which I doubt we will, then the climate crisis becomes a crisis of the mode of production. Okay? My final contribution that I'm trying to make in this new book is to revive a relatively limited discussion 20 years ago about variants of capitalism. Part of the variants of capital discussion comes out of Théorie de la Régulation. Okay? In particular, an economist called Bruno, not Bruno de Conchi, but Bruno Amable. Okay? Bruno Amable, which is like lovable, which he is not. But he's a very interesting guy. So variant of capitalism today, to me, is important because we obviously have different types of capitalism evolving in front of us, right? And we have this kind of neoliberal American system that I will talk to you about it later today. And we have a kind of a social market model in the European Union that has different variations within the Union. And then you have a kind of a state-administered capitalist system in China. You also have different developmentalist models in the global South, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia. These are all different types of developmentalist models. And I can talk to you more about those if you want to. But what you have to understand is that because of the variance of capitalism, crucial policy issues like science and technology are already being addressed differently by different countries. Okay? So it's not a question of finding a consensus for reform that easily. Right? So in order to speed this up, having given you this glossary of the key concepts, right, let me give you some kind of historic context to pinpoint today. One thing that I'm trying to show by kind of a historic analysis is that when you have long waves and you have accumulation regimes to define and identify these long waves, then you also have to respect the fact that you're going to get two types of structural crises. And the first one is kind of a pattern that you see recurrently in the history, which is at the peak of the long wave. The long wave has like a 20, 25, 30-year upswing phase, a boom phase, like in the 50s and 60s, or in the 90s and 2000s, mid-80s to the 2000s, right? Where you have no real crisis, rapid growth, strong globalization in all its aspects, etc., right? And then at the top of that, you get a major financial crisis. So the breakdown of Bretton Woods in the early 70s, for example, right? Or the great financial crisis of the 2007, 2008. Right? And these are typically financial crises, and they end the long wave upswing, and they trigger deflationary adjustments that are basically the characteristic of the downswing phase of the long wave. And then you get to the end of the downswing phase. Okay? We're now at the end of the downswing phase of this particular long wave. We're moving towards the end. That's when you get a critical moment of war or reform. And so my argument is that that's exactly what we're facing right now. Right? And in that context, at the end of the downswing phase, which, remember, my question is, how do we go from one accumulation regime to the next, right? Either through reform or war, right? That's the argument, right? At the end of this process, you have a structural crisis again, right? So to me, the 30s into World War II was the end of a downswing phase that started in 1919. And now we are again. You can say that the early 80s and Reaganomics, the Reagan Revolution, Thatcher on top of that, is the end of a long wave downswing and a structural crisis, right? Famous double-dip recession of the early 1980s. Right? We are now, again, I think, in such a situation, and this time it's an environmental crisis, so it doesn't necessarily have the same parameters as typically you will find. Right? It's just that it's clear that the engine that drives this particular structural crisis, which is basically the degradation of the environment, is extremely active right now already. Right? And so the question then is, how do you get out of this? Right? And at the end of the slide, it's pretty clear to me that either we're dealing with the climate crisis more intensely than we have done, more comprehensively than we've done, more cooperatively than we have done, or the crisis is allowed to continue and then it becomes a much deeper crisis, right? And it can do so within the next 5 to 10 years. And then you have a kind of an inevitable kind of war situation. Right? So I've worked a lot on the international monetary system, and that's part of why Bruno and I are kind of meeting regularly, right? Most of my other work has to do with the international monetary system. And I'm bringing those two strands of research together in the realization that the international monetary system is a key driver of these long waves. If you look at the classic gold standard from 1879 to 1914, if you look at Bretton Woods, 1945 to 1973, if you look at the dollar standard, 1983 to 2007, you realize that each of these configurations of an international monetary system contributed to the upswing by allowing rapid growth in the process of globalization, and the rapid growth in the process of globalization being also a process of countries, certain strategic countries, catching up with the leader. So in the classic gold standard, the US and Germany caught up with Britain. In Bretton Woods, Germany and Japan caught up with the US. In the dollar standard, China caught up with the US. But also other emerging market economies had a rapid growth path. And even industrial nations, especially around the European Union, could also have a rapid growth path. And this has to do with the relationship between the center and the periphery. Okay? And that's how that relationship, which is crucial, gets structured in the national monetary system in such a way that the catching up process, the convergence process, is driven by export-led growth. And the export-led growth is feasible or permissible because in an international monetary system, the currency of the leader is overvalued. That means the currencies of the other countries are undervalued. And that makes the export-led growth feasible. As well as, in order to transfer money from the center to the periphery, the leader has to run deficits. Okay? And the deficits fuel the growth of the others. Okay? So the international monetary systems that we've had in all the different configurations, including even before the classic gold standard in terms of the bimetallic standard of the 19th century, were such that the center plays a progressive role in allowing others to catch up. The problem is when the others have caught up, okay? Because then you get global overproduction conditions, you get global credit overextension conditions, and you get the breakdown of the international monetary system. And typically, that structural crisis that I was referring to, that is the turning point in the long wave, is a financial crisis driven by the collapse of the international monetary system. There's been a pattern 4 times now. Okay, so something is there. Okay, it's a pattern. And the question is then much more complicated, which is in the downswing phase. You get the international monetary system turns on itself. Okay, it goes from a centripetal to a centrifugal system, where it heightens geopolitical tensions, because of the nature of the deflationary adjustments that happen after the crisis, after the breakdown of Bretton Woods, after the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008, you get deglobalization, you get deflationary pressures, you get more competition because of overproduction, you get balance sheet recessions because of the adjustments to get debt levels down and so forth, right? All of these heightened tensions, both within countries and between countries. And so one has to I mean, one of the things that I'm fascinated about is exactly what happens to the international monetary system in that run up to the next structural crisis at the bottom of the long way. Right? So I'm very interested in that. And I see a lot of things happening right now, right? I mean, just a couple of days ago, we had dinner with Paulo Nogueira, right? And we were talking about the BRICS currency, That would be a huge development in getting away from the dollar standard, even if it may not work for years. Okay? But you're beginning to see de-dollarization already. Right? And you're beginning to see the weaponization of the dollar by the US. All of these are not part of the old international monetary system. Okay? Let's be clear about it. So the international monetary system is, as I said, crucial here. I push this button. Oh no, but it has like a slow, you made some change that made it slow. It's the so which button do you push? Which one? Down. Okay. Okay. Let me see. Down, up. Good. Okay. Strange. It makes sense. So what I'm trying to lay out here is that we are simultaneously going through a process where we have growing tensions and processes towards war and growing efforts to have reform. Okay, so we have a simultaneous dynamic of a war and reform dynamic, right? All right. So, I mean, the problem is how do you create a reform program when you have both domestic polarization of politics as well as at the same time mounting geopolitical tensions, right? And I mean, what's interesting here is the New Deal in the US. The New Deal was a profoundly accurate and appropriate reform program. So it's the Keynesian revolution, okay? Except that the Keynesian revolution also happened in Nazi Germany. And in Nazi Germany, it became a kind of a military Keynesianism, okay? And so the irony of ironies was that the Keynesian revolution as a reform program heightened the tensions and contributed to the eventual World War II, right? Because ultimately it became military Keynesianism on both sides. Right. And I see the possibility, I'm mentioning this not least because I see the same thing happening now, right? I'm seeing the beginning of a militarization in all the key, all the key areas, right? It starts with Russia and then the European Union and then China and then the US. So that's usually a harbinger of things to come, right? But the reform program that we have now, which we negotiated actually globally and talked about a lot in the early 2000s, when it went from the Clintons' Millennium Goals to the UN Agenda of 2030, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, that would be the reform to pursue. And that would have to be a global reform. But more broadly, talking about reform, right? In the 19th century, the big question was democracy, as crystallized in the Revolution of 1848. But throughout that century, right? Starting with the American and French and Haitian revolutions in the late 18th centuries, right? In the 20th century, the big question was social, let's say social democracy, right? Income maintenance support, unions and collective bargaining, social policy in terms of access to public goods like housing, education, and healthcare, right? So that's the social, right? And that took the whole century to work out, okay? And in the 21st century, the question is going to be the environment. But all these great themes of reform, democracy, 19th century, social, 20th century, environmental, 21st century, are profoundly polarizing questions, right? The politics that builds around these themes is inherently conflictual. Because capitalism is a class-structured system. It's also a system of exploitation. It's not a system that is run by people who think of the good, of the public good. Okay, it's not. Otherwise, we would have a much better system already. Right? So so the question has always been: how do you make reforms when the key themes of your reform are going to be, conflictual? And then on top of that, these reforms, in order to work, need to have an international dimension, an agreed to cooperative international dimension. You have to build global governance around the reform push. And this is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And you can see this happening, right? Like a trial and by error process, right? When you look at what's going on right now, for example, right? You have, for example, the Paris Agreement on climate, which gave us a global governance framework of trying to deal with this climate crisis. But it's already a voluntary, agreement. Nobody has to do anything, right? It's not binding. It's basically shaming countries into doing things, right? Which, and there's no provision for the fact that there's an incredible environmental injustice issue there, which means basically that the countries that contributed least to the climate crisis are the countries that are going to be affected most by it. And that countries that are contributing a lot to the climate crisis are at very different levels of development. So we have none of these issues get very much addressed in the Paris Climate Agreement, except in marginal terms with the Global Climate Fund or whatever. But even that was to be $100 billion a year, and it just reached $100 billion period. Okay, for after like a decade. So it's like it's a minor version of what is already an inadequate financing mechanism to begin with, right? But also, like, for example, I was just reading about this, right? We had this pandemic. Now we're negotiating a global pandemic preparedness deal, which we just concluded, right? But it doesn't take care of the key question, which is how do you make vaccines or other countermeasures, public health measures, a global public good that everybody has to have available. Right? That's not being addressed, but that's the key question, right? So it's very difficult to actually build these global governance mechanisms, right? And in the meantime, for example, it's very clear, right, that the extreme right in the US, the extreme right in Europe, are fueled by the migration chaos in both places. Right? And the migration chaos is completely insane to have, okay? You already have 220 million people moving right now, most of them because of climate. But you're going to have 5 times as many people moving in 20 or 30, 40 years from now. The easiest thing to do would be to have absolutely no border and let everybody decide wherever they want to go. Okay? That would be the smartest thing to do. It would be smart because it would intrinsically take care of a deep demographic imbalance between the global south and global north. I mean, when I travel to the US is a bloody empty country. Okay. I also hang out in Quebec because my wife grew up there. We have a house there. Quebec is even emptier. Okay. These places could easily, the US could easily take 150 to 200 million people. Okay. As long as people think that anybody contributes to growth and is not a burden, that's already the mindset that we have to have. But it will also force governments to be competitive with each other. If you have no borders and everybody picks whoever you want to go, then the governments that nobody wants to go to are going to have to shape up. Okay. Of course, we're never going to get that. We're never going to get that. Okay. Maybe after a war we will get that. That's the whole point. Wars do radicalize situations tremendously. But what we should get, at least, is a global agreement on how to distribute the migration and how to integrate people as soon as and as fast as possible. That we need to have. If you don't have that, you're going to have war. You're going to have war. Right? This is one of the the global migration chaos is one of the triggers of war. There's others, but this is a key one. So, yes, now I'm confused, of course, because I never. So it was supposed to be war dynamic before reform dynamic, but you know, let's. They're both happening at the same time, so I'm not too upset about this, right? The war dynamic is clearly in place. Let's be clear about this. Okay? You see this by the simultaneous, multifaceted intensification of geopolitical tensions and conflict. Okay? You see this by having commercial conflicts, by having technology sovereignty, right, becoming a kind of a code word for technological competition. You see this by rearmament. You see this by you know, the beginning of war, you know, where you actually have key wars with contagion potential, right? For example, in the 30s, in the 1930s, you had already Mussolini's adventures in Africa, you know, Libya and Abyssinia. You have also, of course, Japan's invasion of China. And we have this today. We have today, you know, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and we have also the Middle East war. I wrote Gaza, but I'm now becoming increasingly clear that this is going to be a Middle East war, ultimately between Iran and Israel. And what's important about these wars is that the fact that they spread, and they're driven by leaders who cannot stop the war. They cannot stop the war. Okay. Neither Putin nor Netanyahu can stop the war. They would die if they did. Okay, they know it. I mean, Netanyahu wouldn't die, but he would go to prison. And so that's a crucial part of how you get into a world war. That you have these other wars that are brewing, and these wars sharpen global alliances. Right? What's crucial to world war is to have an intensification of global alliances where the leaders of the global alliances force countries to choose. That's what I mean, the sharpening of the global alliance. Brazil is in a very good position, but it will have to face that sharpening of the global alliance pretty soon. Okay? Where the US is going to say, you with us or you with the Chinese? This is going to come within the next 2 years, no matter who wins in the US, okay? And so you also have clearly in that process the rise of demagogic leaders who make it an us versus them choice. And I would say it's not just Trump, but also Xi Jinping. To me, Xi Jinping, while a very interesting leader, clearly is also demagogically. He uses us versus them quite strongly in his discourse, right? Now, what troubles me the most, and I live there, so I see it every day, is that the US politically is not able to make any reforms without intensifying conflict at home and globally. Okay? And you can see this any way that you want, every bloody day. Let me give you an example. Last Thursday, everybody was obsessed with the disastrous debate performance by Biden, which is bad news, I can tell you that. Okay? Because if Trump wins, the chances for World War III are significantly higher. But what didn't go noticed at all was the Supreme Court is wrapping up its term, and the Supreme Court is making decisions. And the Supreme Court is a very radical right-wing Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court made a decision on Friday to change the way regulatory agencies in the US are doing their regulations. They upended what is known as the Chevron decision of 1984. In the Chevron decision, which the Supreme Court struck down, the regulatory agency basically decides how to interpret the language of Congress, the language of the law. Okay? So if you take the if you take the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act of 1970 in the US, that is regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a very important regulatory agency responsible for regulating climate change. They look at the law and they decide to interpret the law and then make regulations based on that law. The regulatory agencies, since Friday, no longer have that power. Whatever they decide automatically gets vetted by the judiciary, by judges. And the judges are right-wing judges for the most part. Okay? So you basically made a decision to destroy whatever little regulatory authority the US government had, okay, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, which is much less than Europe has already to begin with. Now it is even less. But that also means that no matter whether Trump or not gets elected, the difficulty of the US government to deal with climate change has just dramatically intensified and has become a matter of battleground between the government and the judiciary. Okay? So I'm just trying to give you an example that whatever the US does right now amplifies conflict. Even Biden has been pushed into conflict, which is not his usual self, right? And so this has incredible consequences, right? Because if the US slows down climate change mitigation adaptation, the rest of the world will do so too. Then the climate crisis gets much worse than it should have been. It becomes basically unmanageable, and then we're going to have to face this as the drama of the tragedy of our century, which is pretty clearly going to happen, right? Okay, so talking about variants of capitalism, yes. I'm making this point about the US because to me the US is in an odd decline phase, right? And which gives more space for other variants of capitalism to kind of catch up to the US and challenge it, right? And one of the dimensions of the decline is that the US built a global governance system that's also disintegrated, right? This is the Bretton Woods system, right? Whether it's the IMF, whether it's the World Trade Organization, whether it's the World Bank, these organizations are incapable of adjusting to the new conditions and in crisis, and they're kind of eroding gradually, right? More or less. I mean, the WTO is basically paralyzed. The IMF is still around and now run by better people than before, but it still has a huge difficulties to respond to the current conditions, right? And so at the same time, you have BRICS construction, which is slow, underperforming, but it's there. And you also have pressure in the European Union, right? The European Union is in an amazingly complicated situation, which we can talk about a bit later, right? But it's on the one hand, pressure to do more, and on the other hand, it's now giving rise to political forces that wanted to do less. And so it has a lot of pressure, right? And in that context, which is what we are not right now, we're going to get very soon to the question of war reform. Right? So to conclude my talk, bringing it back to technology and also setting it up for the post-break second conversation, you have to think of the new environmental accumulation regime as essentially technology dependent and technology driven in ways that has not happened before. My argument would be that we have qualitatively more profound technological change than we had before because we are now allowing machines to do things with us that we've never had before. So we're going to get into a very intimate, complicated relationship with machines. Okay? And we're just beginning that process. And even now, I can tell you that, having taught for over 50 years, I can see successive generations of students being different human beings, having been totally tied like an umbilical cord to their little machines, whatever their little machines are. Right? And this is particularly virulent in the US. You know, I mean, I watch around, I just watch people's habits with their phones and with their, their little, iPads or whatever. Right? It's very interesting to me. Right? But clearly, everywhere I go, human beings are not the same people anymore as they used to be. In terms of attention spans, in terms of communication skills, in terms of how they see the world, in terms of, I mean, you're scrolling and you're sliding instead of reading and thinking, which is much slower, all of that. Right? But this is just the beginning. Once you have artificial intelligence running its course, and then you get quantum computing running its course, and you get nanotechnology running its course, all of these are technological revolutions in place moving forward. We will get into an interaction with machines on a completely different level than before. But at the same time, we also have to allow much more space for nature, because we're destroying it and nature is biting back. Nature is literally is biting our ass. And it will do so more and more violently unless we treat it differently and treat it better. So we also have that challenge at the same time, right? And so because we are not collectively interested in higher prices, which is one way to make the transition, and we're also politically not in a position to accept the premature obsolescence of half of our economy and write it off and figure out how to socialize the losses. We're not able to do that, okay? Because of those two failures, which are human nature failures, we depend on technology to solve the problem, right? And it doesn't. It's only one element. We also have to change behaviors. We have to write off and amortize, capacities massively, and we're not going to want to do that, right? And so we have to understand the role of technology. Okay? And so we have two revolutions. We have a digital revolution and we have a green revolution. Both of them are technologically driven. Right? And of course, they're connecting at some point, and how they connect is extremely interesting and important. And there's going to be variants of capitalism are going to have different connections, right? But what's key here to understand, and what we need to revive, both economically and politically, is the idea of global public goods, which is things that everybody should have access to. I mean, basically, global public goods are massively socially beneficial. It is massively socially beneficial to have a system of pandemic prevention. It's massively socially beneficial to have food security. It's massively socially beneficial to allow migrants to go where they need to go and want to go and integrate them rapidly. It's massively socially beneficial not to allow the spread of weapons of mass destruction. It's massively socially beneficial to have a proper cybersecurity system against cyber warfare. Okay? It's massively socially beneficial to have pandemic preparedness. All of these are global public goods that are dependent and shaped by the technologies we're talking about, the digital and the green revolution. Right? But we also see the opposite tendency, which is that globally speaking, both the digital revolution and the green revolution are becoming matters of power politics, geopolitical tensions. And so we are now crystallizing around that, exactly that tension between cooperation and competition, between coordination and conflict, as the question of war or reform. Thank you.
much, Robert, for this very, very interesting, although a bit boring
Yeah, it is worse.
presentation. And let's go for the questions. We have 20 minutes more or less. So we start here, and then we go there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe,
Thank you for
Bruno,
the presentation.
maybe we answer each question, because if I get 4 or 5 questions, I'm like an old man.
Thank you for the presentation, Professor. I have a question about the beginning of your presentation when you talked about the monetary system being the driver of the long waves. I found it enlightening, but I'm more used to a different view about technology being the driver of this change. My question is if there is a way to harmonize both views, or how these things synchronize.
Yes. Yes. I mean, look, the whole point about this approach, theorie de la régulation, is to elaborate the interaction between the different institutional pillars of the accumulation regime. Right? So if you have, and technology is always a factor, right? It's a factor in the types of competition, institutional pillar. It's a factor in the wage labor nexus, institutional pillar. It's a factor in the types of state intervention, etc. Right? But for example, right, just to give you an idea, in the system about to come, right, you're going to have digital money. And you're going to have digital money, not cryptocurrencies in the US, but you're going to have digital money in terms of central bank digital coins, right? Which the Chinese are already piloting, and the European Union are also thinking about. And the reason why Bruno is going to disappear for a year shortly is because he's studying that in Paris, right? And so, so you have a new international monetary system emerging based on digital money, which the US is not interested in adopting. So that's already very interesting that the Chinese are adopting it and the European Union, but not the US. But that's going to be a fillip, a multiply accelerator in the digital revolution. Right? You don't have to say either or. You don't have to say either technology or international monetary system. You have to put them all together. You have to figure out how they interact. That would be my answer to you. But also, by the way, in the future, you're going to have a particular type of carbon money. You're going to have financing mechanisms to reduce emissions that we don't have right now, right? And so I'm in my book, Eco-Capitalism, I have a whole end chapter envisaging how you can have an international monetary system that helps the socio-ecological transition and prevents war.
Hi, Professor. Yeah, hi, Professor. Thanks for the presentation. As I mentioned to you before, I like your book, Regulation Theory. But I was wondering, when you were speaking, you were making arguments that sounded a lot like Giovanni Arrighi. I was wondering if you could talk Giovanni
Arrighi, yes.
Yeah, when we're talking about how the kind of institutional configuration which allowed the US to become hegemonic is now better on any kind of shift to a reform. So I was wondering, do you engage with Arrighi in your new book, or what's your take?
Well, yes. Well, I have a whole complicated relationship to the whole world system theory.
Yeah.
And I like it a lot, and I'm trying to integrate it. And I'm still struggling with it. Some of Arrighi and Wallerstein, and they're fitting into my approach, and some of the stuff doesn't fit. And it's kind of, I'm too respectful of them to just take whatever they have that fits to me. So I want to have an argument with them. And so I'm trying to figure out whether I can actually offer a chapter where I'm going to put together a debate between the regulationists, the way I see it, and the world system theory people, the way you see it. They're probably too obsessed with the question of hegemony and hierarchy. And that's always a very complicated, because you have a dialectics in this relationship, right? And to me, war reform is both a dialectical process in itself and between each other, right? And so world system theory has a kind of a structure that doesn't highlight or spatially allow these double dialectics. Okay.
Yeah. Hello, Professor. Thank you for the presentation. My question is regarding the effective use of, or rather the management of global public goods. So there are like two questions. First is, how do you like define global public goods? Because it ranges from clean air, then we have the effective use of weapons of mass destruction, and why not include the access to clean water,
Yes.
then access to food. So it is like literally everything that a human being needs for like survival. And the second question regarding the global public goods is that in a structure where we will decide uh, the management of global public goods, who is going to take a lead, or rather, who should take a lead? Will it be the trade blocs or institutions like the UN, or rather the countries who are like leading the world in the 21st century?
Well, typically it's not one or the other. Okay, I mean, typically you have some kind of institutional framework that's global, and you build some kind of institutions that are managing whatever the global public good is, like the World Health Organization will manage the Pandemic Preparedness Act, right? But it's still a matter of course, also in the day-to-day nitty-gritty, informal unfolding of managing global public goods. It's always the power structure that matters a lot, right? So which countries are more committed, right? And competition can be very helpful in that regard, right? I mean, there's also going to be a competition between the European Union, China, and the US for the rest of the world, right? And that can be done very productively on the question of global public goods. But to get back to your first comment, right? And I may have only mentioned it briefly and not highlighted enough. To me, the agenda is the 17 global public goods as defined as the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, of which clean water and clear air are part of, right? But when you look at the 17 SDGs, they are what we need, right? And we need them globally. And we need to also then have an action plan. And the UN does have an action plan, but the UN is not the body that is capable right now to make any but the most limited progress here, right? When you go and look at what has happened to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they're all behind schedule. But they are they're not dead. They're constant efforts, right? So we are in the beginning of a process where we're realizing this is what we have to go for, right? And part of the global politics will be around these sustainable development goals.
Thank you, Professor. I'm thinking how to avoid war and maybe go beyond reform. So how do you think political organization today? So for example, should we think that each accumulation regime maybe needs different models of political organization? Like, okay, Bolshevik organization before, but what is to be done today?
You're asking me about, I want to make sure I understand your question. You're asking me about whether different power structures, power blocks can have different types of political organization, besides asking me also what should be the political organization against war?
Yeah, I mean more social organization, like should we think about a party like we used to think like before? Or how you think like should be the working class organization today to try to avoid these issues?
Well, we need to have a global understanding that we're facing this choice of war or reform. And we need to have a globally organized politics, right? That captures this, you know, as a point of unification between different groups in different countries, right? So we need to actually mobilize the politics of that choice. You understand what I'm saying, right? We need to have a clearer understanding of how we talk to people about their framing of what they think are the key choices and what ultimately how that relates to the actual process of making a decision about war or reform, right? That's possible. People are very responsive, I've found in the US already, to framing the question that I frame, right? It gets their attention, right? And so I think that what I'm trying to, I'm trying to write this book for a public that, where I kind of contribute a little bit to this kind of evolving discussion, right? I think that in the next 5 or 10 years, because of the far right taking over in more and more places, right, there's going to be a lot of pushback, right? The left is completely without having the tools of a global approach, and the left will have to figure out how to frame this choice and how to talk to people about it.
Thank you very much, Professor. I have a page of questions, so I'm going to limit myself to the time. You thought about world systems, and it actually makes me think of much more Branko Milanovic. Branko Milanovic had a book. Milanovic.
Yes.
Wrote a couple of years ago, 2019, I believe, on group variants of capitalism. And he distinguishes liberal meritocratic capitalism from political capitalism. So I was wondering, A, what you thought of that, and B, going forward then a little bit, what you think of variant of global capitalism or global governance capitalism would look like.
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer your question. I'm trying to, I know Branko Milanovic, but I don't know him well enough, of course. But I'm trying to frame or revive this variance of capitalism within this theory of regulation, right? As a matter of looking at how different models, right, organize the current configuration of institutional innovation in capitalism, right? And some of that you will hear in the second talk when I make a distinction between how the Europeans approach innovation and how the Americans approach innovation, right? I'm trying very hard not to get too early into a categorization of variance of capitalism so that I get a fuller picture of how politics and policy works in China versus the European Union versus Brazil versus South Africa versus Saudi Arabia, right? I'm interested in how governments and politics make these adjustments right now, right? So I'm trying to use variance of capitalism to explain better the key question for me, which is how do you get from one accumulation regime to another, right? So I'm trying not to actually make a theory of the variance of capitalism. Right? I'm trying to use this as an argument for transition, which is kind of different than Branko or different what Bruno Amabel did. Yes, sure.
So I'm happy enough with this presentation that you then specifically BRICS.
Yes.
We talked about some of the failure or growing dislocation.
Yes.
Whether you see BRICS and the organization of BRICS as it appears at the moment, stabilizing, destabilizing in the international system and innovation.
Those are incredibly interesting and relevant questions, right? I'm not a specialist on BRICS, right? But it strikes me that there's two things, it's like a minimum maximum viewpoint, right? At a minimum, they don't have much in common, except they're against the current structure, US dominated structure, right? That's clear, right? So they're trying to figure out how to coordinate better and how to kind of, converge a bit more, right? But then again, there's an internal power structure where China is really the kind of the dominant force, right? Whatever. BRICS will go as far as China wants it to go. Let's put it this way, right? And BRICS could be a very progressive force in challenging an increasingly crazy America. Okay? And so it could find its own collective enterprise, right? By committing itself to advancing, let's say the sustainable development, right? Of making sustainable development its crucial mission. Then it would be a very progressive force, and it would basically become the center of the new global governance. And this would be a very different global governance system than the one that the Americans had, or the ones that the British had, right? But you also have Pax Britannica and Pax Americana, both lasting 1 century, right? Because both superpowers managed transitions from one accumulation regime to another one without war, okay? In the 1870s with Britain, and in the 1970s, 80s with the US, right? And the Reagan Revolution basically also had a military component, an important one, that destroyed the Soviet Union without war, right? Because it was already in the crisis of the mode of production, right? And whether Reagan understood it, he didn't. But people behind him, like James Baker and George Shultz and Cap Weinberger, they understood that, right? And so BRICS right now could be and is, in a way, besides the European Union, the only other power pole, right? The other that can challenge the US. So that makes it, by definition, an incredibly important force.
Robert, Professor, really interesting, mainly, well, a lot of things such as long durée, varieties of capitalism. It's really good to listen in this school. I have a question that, in fact, it goes with the regulationist school, in the sense that, don't you think that in some point the agenda is a little bit European centered?
Yes.
And European, yes, and my feeling is with this is also with the European Marxists, in the sense that, I mean, they are really upset with the system, but they are now seeing that, for example, Asia is growing a lot. There are processes of accumulation. You have new middle income people. Poverty is going down. But I mean, the diagnostic of the whole system is as the system is in a crisis, and in fact, Europe is in it. But the system is okay. I mean, no, I would not say it's okay. There are many problems. Of course, there are many problems. But if you look the whole picture, I think that you are not looking where the capitalism is going. The dynamic is there. It's not in Europe. The point is that. But, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. I mean, I'm kind of, especially when I come to places like Campinas and other places I go to, I realize, there's a completely different world out there, right? That when I'm in Paris or New York, I don't see it, right? I do see it in the sense that I talk to people across the world, and I also travel and I read different things from different places, right? But it's totally true. I mean, that this is a European Marxist-centric. But Alieta is obsessed with China, goes to China all the time. Boyer is obsessed with Korea and Japan, goes to Korea and Japan all the time. Right? They are not; those guys are not as blind as you make them out to be. Right? But it's true that both from an American point of view and in a European point of view, you have to make an effort to not be self-centered and see the world only from that particular point of view. You understand? And it's even more true for American leftists. They're completely US bound. And it's sad. So how do I feel about this? I think I'm trying to be as much as possible, and I think I'm increasingly growing capable of taking a global approach. I know that this is a work in progress, and I may never get there, you know. But I'm very aware. I'm looking at this as globally as I can, and I'm trying to know everything. I'm trying to know something about every country in the world. That's my goal. Yes, I'm trying to distill your questions, but I guess one of the questions would be about Keynes's banker plan, which I think is a reasonably good solution to revive in a future configuration of multipolar capitalism. Right? It's quite possible that you're going to have a constellation geopolitically of different power centers, right? And each one of those power centers having a distinctly unique type of organization of environmental capitalism as the next accumulation regime. Right? You actually have an embryo of banker already in what is called the special drawing rights of the IMF. And I've spent quite a lot of publication time, and since 1985, to figure out different proposals of how you can beef up or expand the circulation and use of SDRs beyond their current embryonic state to turn them gradually, step by step, into something like Bancor. And the advantage of having an international monetary system based on a global money, which is not a national currency, is very radical. Okay, you don't need to have those deficits that transfer dollars or euros or yuan from the issuing country, which issues the world money to the rest of the world. Right? You can have, therefore, more coordination. But the point about international money requires pretty profound coordination between those power blocks in terms of keeping their macroeconomic balances and macroeconomic prices like exchange rates, interest rates, inflation rates, profit rates, and wage rates in some kind of coordinated balance, right? Which is one of the advantages of the system, but it's also one of the constraints of the system, right? But I'm pretty sure that there's a distinct possibility, not by the time I'm still alive, but by the time you're still alive, that you're going to get movement in that direction, right? Because it's not clear to me at all how China and Chinese currency becomes the next dollar, okay? And I don't think the Chinese would want that either, for a variety of reasons we can talk about, right? So there's that, right? And I think that the idea of the digital coin makes it actually more likely that it can happen in terms of the payment system technology, okay? To have a supranational current, supranational money system. In terms of people moving, look, it's the question of how do you treat human beings that are from somewhere else coming to you, right? I was born in a refugee camp, so I'm obviously talking as a refugee even today, 73 years later, right? In terms of like, I want to go wherever I can, right? And I did. I've been living in 6 different countries, right? So I have that kind of experience. And of course, because I was always pursuing studies and then become a professor and then, be recognized, it was easy for me to move around and get into at a high level of entry, right? But when you're talking about Europe right now, you have 2 dramas. You have the Ukrainian drama and you have the Syrian drama before it. And people are handling the Ukrainians and the Syrians completely different. So this is a fountain of racism, okay? And you have to be, the human species, to save itself, will have to stop being racist, okay? The superordinate, in this crisis, especially vis-a-vis machines and nature, we're gonna have superordinate goals as a species, which are more powerful than us, the differences between us in terms of, whether we're, blonde or blue-eyed or not, right? You understand what I'm saying, right? So not only is the current migration problem a trigger for whatever latent racism was there, and sexism and cultural prejudices, and they become sharpened because people are coming, right? But it's also the way people are allowed to come in already puts them in a marginal position where they become a burden not because they are a burden, but because they're treated as a burden. You know, if you treat people as a burden, they will become a burden. If you treat people as a welcoming group, they will become a welcoming group, right? So it's how we treat each other that's the key question. Nothing else matters. You can deal with every single problem meaningfully if you give up all the bullshit about all the isms in the world, okay? And that's easily understandable, ultimately, okay? I don't know whether that makes sense. I hope that's enough of an answer.
Good morning, Professor.
Yes.
I've got 2 questions for you. As you know, that technology advancement is taking place, and soon we are, as you said, that we are like connected to the technology. Do you think that machines are better at decision making in case of any war or conflict because they're more rational, they're not emotional? As human beings, we are more selfish, and you think, and they will bring more transparency to the bureaucracy system at decision making? That's my first question. And the second question is, do you think that machines like economics and environment sustainability can go hand in hand? If you talk about the 12th goal, which is responsible consumption, the other day I was talking to a guy. He said that he goes to a thrift shop to buy second-hand clothes because he doesn't want them to produce more clothes. So economics says that you know, put in money, trade, and all that, you know. But since we are producing so much, do you think that if we want to move towards environment sustainability, we need to like stop the economic activities or slow down? Professor Nicholas also said that China is producing too much and they're dumping into other countries. So do you think that economics and sustainability can go hand in hand? Thank you.
Oh, well. I mean, first of all, you know, 2 things. I don't automatically think that machines are better than humans in terms of neutrality. Okay? Machines are not neutral. Machines are used by humans, and they become part of the human extension. So they're never neutral. Technology always has a social context. Right? But it becomes dramatically more qualitatively complicated when you have learning machines that work together. And so the neural networks of machines and how they drive each other, we have absolutely no clue how that's going to work. Okay, we know we're terrified by it, and we're also hopeful for it, but we do not know yet what the consequences of artificial intelligence 30, 40, 50 years from now will be. Okay, and so, you know, I have a suspicion that we will look at the cumulative power of machines working together in a whole different way than we think of it today. And it's not going to be so innocent or neutral. Right? We're going to have this battle with the machines. Who controls whom? And that's going to be an important battle. And that question also then relates to how technology can work with sustainability or not. Because in and of itself, it's as likely to be adding to our unsustainability thanks to this incredible energy demand that comes with these machines than adding to sustainability by making things easier or innovation or whatever you want to talk about, right? So it's going to be a mixed problem, right? How to make machines and sustainably work together. I don't know enough about it yet, and I can just think about what I see in terms of evolution, right? Does that help? Yes, the degrowth question. Look, when I was in Paris, right, I had a lot of Marxist students that were clearly also ecological economists and not environmental economists, and they were into degrowth. And I had huge arguments with them all the time. So I'm not, you know, I know that my history in having debates with my dissertation students that were almost violent because they were so sectarian about it, made me shape a little warped, right? Okay. But I also know that we're consuming too much, more than we need, because I can see Americans eat, right? and Americans drive cars that are the size of this, right? And so, that's ridiculous. So I would say that it makes sense to have a different notion of growth altogether, and to make it a much more deeply social process and discussion than an individual acquisition vector. Okay? And so I think we can find a balancing, and we can also, I think we will phase out growth to some degree, because we will also have shrinking populations. And so we will have shrinking populations going forward. I'm pretty sure of that. And so I think that in itself will take care of a lot of the growth question. Well, I mean, usually you can do this with a price mechanism, right? You can also do it with taxes and regulations, right? And you can have global agreements on phasing this out and phasing that in, right? So there's different ways that institutionally you can handle that question. Yes, nada, sorry.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Gutmann, for your presentation. I would like to hear more from you about this new developmentalist models, especially the Brazilian and the Indian one. I'm a student in the BRICS group, and I noticed that both Lula and Modi are trying to present themselves as like the leaders of the global South. They have taken the opportunity of the G20 presidency to show how they are thinking multilateralism and how they are how they could be these leaders who are presenting an alternative to the U.S. Western and the Chinese bloc. So I would like to hear more from you, and what do you think about what would be more attractive for the developing countries?
Well, I'm not sure that either Brazil or India lend themselves easily to becoming models for developing countries, okay? Because developing countries have to find their own solutions in a very, differentiated set of circumstances, right? And Brazil and India wouldn't also group together. I mean, India is the most populous country in the world, has rapid population growth still, has rapid urbanization still. It's in a different development stage than Brazil is, right? And I also think that Modi is a particular type of leader that contributes to conflict rather than to peaceful construction of alternatives. Right? So I'm not a great Modi fan, right? He's a polemical person. He has a long history of anti-Muslim activity, and he's gotten worse, if not better, over the years, right? I do think that Brazil has an incredibly important position to roll, precisely, as a big power, as an emerging power that has connections to everybody, right? And has a strong tradition of diplomacy and successful diplomacy, right? So, and I'm not saying that just because the Brazilians have invited me to talk here, right? I've followed this country for a while. So, but look, I mean, the inner tensions between BRICS, especially as it expands, right? It has slow development in its own, among its 5 or 6 members, but it's taking on more members that are even further apart from each other, right? And so, we'll see how this plays out, right? It has to have more than just defining itself by anti-Americanism, and it may do that, and it may do that through the international monetary route, right? You can have there's already the new development bank. There's going to be a possibility of pooling reserves together. and then using it as a redistribution mechanism. And then there's this basket currency that you can create, right? Which I think would be incredibly helpful and useful, including moving towards that supranational money arrangement that I was alluding to in response to Elias's question, right? Does that help as an answer? Okay. Yes. Okay. So I must decidedly emphasize to you that I'm not a specialist on science, technology, and innovation policy. Even though I've been thinking about it, and looking at it, and reading about it all my life since my dissertation, which was in the 70s. Right? But I do realize that, you know, in my own studies, the next accumulation regime will be very powerfully technology driven in ways that are qualitatively different from any technologies we've had so far. And in that sense, I'm also paying a lot more attention to it right now as we speak. Okay. So as I mentioned to you at the end of my last presentation, we're going through this dual process, this dual technological revolution of digital and environmental or green. And we have, as I already mentioned as well, we have many global public goods associated with those technological changes that are important. In this sense, I want to add something that is perhaps not easily understood right away. When I'm talking about global public good, I'm also including now the prevention of catastrophe. Okay, so I'm including the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as a global public good, right? Sustainable agriculture as a global public good. The prevention of pandemics as a global public good, right? The containment of the spread of weapons of mass destruction as a global public good, right? So not having disaster, not having catastrophe, and moving and taking steps in that direction has to be included as a global public good. Right? And that's particularly true in the face of all these threats we face today. Right? But I also am aware that the unfolding technological revolutions, both the digital and the green one, depend on completely strategic elements that are like bottlenecks of control and access. Like, for example, a specific type of very powerful computer chip for the AI revolution. Or rare earth metals and minerals for the green revolution. Okay? Because there are these bottlenecks, and there will be future bottlenecks that we don't yet understand or see, there's going to be always potential for conflict in terms of just who controls this, okay? And it will also position certain countries differently who have access to these, or who are the suppliers of these strategic elements, in a very different position. I mean, Taiwan today is incredibly, it's a small little island off the Chinese coast, but it's an incredibly powerful place in terms of having this capacity for the chips for the next generation, right? And but it's also going to be probably the trigger for World War III. It's going to be Taiwan. The US is trying to get Taiwan's capacities through the Chips and Science Act, right? So they're making Taiwan a subsidiary of the US. They're inviting Taiwan, that company, it's called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, right? They're treating it as an American company. This drives China crazy. Because China's biggest Achilles heel is that it doesn't have access to those chips technology yet. And so, you know, you can see just around the question of Taiwanese chip production that becomes a casus belli, right? A reason for war. That's kind of just to illustrate what I was trying to say, that the strategic elements that are crucial to the unfolding of these technological revolutions will be causes of conflict. and danger. There's another reason for conflict is the incredibly important first comer advantage in those technologies. Because they're radical technologies, they're transformative technologies, they're technologies cutting across sectors and products. Being the first is really important. Okay? You have a first comer advantage. And the first comer advantage is not only to grab market share that becomes more and more difficult to unseat, but to also set the standards. Set the standards. So there is going to be an intense global battle for who sets standards. Okay? And you can think of the standards as not just technological, but also social, the social practices that come with specific technologies, right? That gets also embedded in the first comer advantage, right? So there is going to be intense technological competition just around gaining the first comer advantage. So when we're talking about divergent tensions of the accumulation regime transforming science, technology, innovation policy, yes? So one of the things that you can see is that, and I see this from the point of the US, right? The STI, science, technology, innovation policy, has already become a source of conflict. And the conflict gets propagated very much, not least by the US, right? So it's a pretty stunning array of activities that I can identify in that regard. And remember, we are talking about war reform. So if you have a policy push that prioritizes conflict, you're gonna make it much harder to have reform on a global level, right? So, for example, in 2015, we put in place a new regime for preventing the spread of nuclear technology. That was the deal with Iran, the Joint Cooperation Plan of Action. And this was set up as something that can be repeated. It was set up as a global governance mechanism, okay? With particular types of countries involved, International Energy Agency involved, supervision regime, monitoring regime, a way of negotiating, step-by-step processes. I mean, it was an amazing deal, okay? And in a way, a model for the future. And, it got destroyed by Trump in a day. He just got out of that treaty as much as he got out of the Paris Agreement, which, tells you what's going to happen if he wins and when he wins. Right? But even Biden, Biden's tariffs on green Chinese imports that are green technology imports, which would be a good thing to have. Right? You want to make green technology as cheap as possible. You want to spread it. You want to have more competition. Why set up prohibitive tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle imports or battery technology imports? That you see that this is a conflict-oriented approach rather than a pro-change approach, right? One thing that worries me, because it is a war, and I'm looking at new types of war, and I see it happening, is the growing intensity of cyber warfare between countries. I mean, Israel and the US are attacking Iran. Russia is attacking Estonia all the time. You just Google Russia, Estonia, internet. You get a lot of stories, okay? The Russians and the Chinese are interfering in elections, right? So you get a lot of tensions in cyberspace, right? And this is clearly going to intensify over time. And then something that the US, you should pay attention to it because it's a very powerful bipartisan, in the middle of civil war, you have this bipartisan consensus in Congress around what is called CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investments in the US, which restricts foreign access to American technology. Right? And has expanded its horizon to go after after enemies, okay, to punish them and to just as they weaponize the dollar, they weaponize access to US technology. Okay? So you have this CFIUS becoming more and more aggressive and more, you know, I mean, now it's going after TikTok, it went after Huawei, it picks its targets, but it looks for targets all the time. And it's bipartisan, so there's a weird dynamic of competition between certain Republican leaders and certain Democratic leaders that are on that committee, that are future presidential hopefuls, and that are making, they're having competition who's more anti-China, which I find very terrifying. More broadly, and I think this is something that I'm very interested in, but don't know much about, right? You can see the tension between cooperation and conflict playing out in the most basic way on technology transfer and knowledge diffusion regimes. Okay, so this is typical. This is, I mean, translates into a tension between strong intellectual property rights, which give innovators monopoly, temporary monopoly over their ideas, versus open source, where everybody can get access easily to the unfolding technological developments. Okay? So, you know, I mean, strong intellectual property rights hamper diffusion of knowledge, right? And give monopoly to innovators, and that's like that's a recipe for conflict, right? Open source is much more cooperation, but I think that this tension can play out in a much more meaningful way around knowledge commons, which is a middle ground, right? Where in the future we can have widespread access to new know-how, new technology necessary for people, necessary to have, right? But the participants in that commons, making it a commons, manage this resource collectively and manage, therefore, its access and use under certain rules, right, and normative contexts, right? So you can have a middle ground between intellectual property rights and open source that ultimately makes a lot more sense to have both competition and cooperation embedded in the advancement of technology, right? So-called knowledge commons. And so I'm quite interested in that. And see great possibilities for that in the future. Right? I'm aware that when you have crisis, you get more cooperation. So the pandemic was a crisis, and even though China and the US positioned themselves as enemies in that regard, and even though there was a lot of craziness about vaccine distribution in the broader context of the globe, there is cooperation now to have a better pandemic preparedness regime, right? And the new agreement that was basically negotiated a couple of months ago is quite interesting in that regard, right? You will also have global cooperation with food security, because that becomes increasingly a problem. And people will realize in the centers like the US that if they don't provide food security in Honduras, where agriculture is collapsing, they're going to get millions of Hondurans coming to the US. It's better to actually rebuild agriculture in a more sustainable way in Honduras by investing there, and then people don't come, right? So the choices will present themselves in that way, and then that will encourage cooperation. The other thing that I see, and this is very much shaped by, again, my leftist students in France, and maybe that's very Eurocentric, and tell me, please, if you think that is, right? But I do see a strong possibility of moving into a very different type of capitalism. Okay? A much more bottom-up, community-based capitalism. And especially, I think, precisely in managing the power of machine networks and managing our relationship to nature, that would logically encourage group solutions, communitarian solutions, right? And I'm looking here at commons, I'm looking at cooperatives, I'm looking at the circular economy of recycling, I'm looking at the broader context of the social solidarity economy as a political movement in Europe. Right? I don't know how it is here. I know it barely exists in the US, but it does every now and then exist. But it's an interesting movement beyond the often stale dichotomy between market and state. Right? So I have some hope there. And I need some hope because I'm getting increasingly depressed about what's going on. So let me talk to you about the US. I'm not American, you have to understand that, right? And I'm still, I never became an American citizen for a reason. But I love living in New York. And that gives me a good vantage point from watching the rest of the US. And it's very hard to discuss the US, especially in terms of policy. The US does not have a Department of Industry, does not have a Department of Science Innovation. It doesn't have any, it doesn't even have a Department of Trade. It already makes you wonder, what kind of government is this? Well, it's a very pro-business government. Okay? That's the essence. It's incredibly pro-business. Okay? It's hard to understand for anybody who has not lived there how pro-business it is. So the government is basically not a regulator of business, but a supporter of business. That's a very different mindset. But it also has a population that is obsessed with change and that is always looking for new gimmicks and new things to have, where technology is a status symbol in ways that I have not seen elsewhere. I'm stunned by how entrepreneurial the place is. I mean, my American students are all dreaming about setting up their own businesses, right? It's very easy to set up a business there, right? My mother came to the US when she was 54. She spoke no English. She had a successful business within 6 months, and it took her a week to set it up. The taxes for businesses. I know you have a very painful tax reform of millions of different taxes that drive businesses crazy here. American corporate taxation is very simple, other than them getting subsidies for tax breaks, which they have lobbied and written the laws for themselves. Businesses write the laws of tax breaks or regulation for the government. That's how pro-business it is. Right? But another huge difference that I think is quite unique in the US is how the financial system there works. First of all, it's much more market-based than bank-based. So you have financial markets. And the financial markets are important also for tech, because NASDAQ is a high-tech financial market that has to do with the listing requirements of companies in NASDAQ as opposed to the other stock markets in the US. You also have private credit, you have venture capital, you ultimately have a huge investor class. This has to be understood, okay? Americans, even middle-class Americans, are investors. They have to be investors. They have to be investors because the state does not provide adequate public goods in terms of education, health, or retirement. Each of these areas you have state minimum, but nobody wants to do the state minimum. Nobody wants to go to Medicaid. Nobody wants to go to public university. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but most public universities are for immigrants. Immigrants go to public universities. They're affordable. Okay? So Americans basically look for private solutions to what should be public goods. Okay, so they go to private universities. They go to private healthcare. And for that, they need to invest. They need to have investor funds. So the government gives them investment funds that are tax excluded, that were compounding without taxes. And where you also get tax breaks just to put money into those funds, right? So Americans have these education-based funds and these healthcare-based funds, okay, and these private pension plans, and that makes them investors. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because I'm not sure that you're used to that, right? But this also feeds a very large array of financial markets and market arrangements, right? Which then help fund technology. There's substantial amount of private funding of technology, okay? High risk technology, okay? And that is a specifically American feature that I've not seen anywhere else. And that coexists with research universities that I will talk to you about it in the next slide, okay? But right now you also need to understand that in this business-friendly, pro-change, high-tech environment, the high-tech companies are incredibly powerful. And they're not restricted. You cannot restrict them regulatorily. Okay? The government has tried and has basically given up, right? It's the Europeans that restrict Google or Apple or Microsoft, not the Americans. Right? And so that's, basically what you have is this very powerful engine of highly concentrated capital that is developing technology. And that their interaction between them are incredibly complex and interesting, right? You're taking like these 10 high-tech companies. They have each one of them between 500 and 2,000 other companies that they carry with them in networks. They have product differentiation strategies where they avoid each other. They have competition where they clash with each other. They go across sectors, right? So they're breaking down the traditional industrial matrix of the economy. And they foster extremely rapidly new companies that come out of the blue. I mean, NVIDIA is now, the second largest company in the world by market capitalization, but 3 years ago it didn't exist. So that tells you, like, what the hell? How does this happen, right? NVIDIA is larger than Google, okay? And so, but that's the financial part of it, right? It's how much capital can be mobilized there in a hurry for promising new technologies. Right? And so it has this it has this kind of very strange capitalist system that drives on financial bubbles. NVIDIA is a bubble in a way. Right? One thing that I wanted to tell you is that not only are people investors and have these funds, but capital gains in America, okay, which is basically buying assets at a price and then selling assets later at a higher price. The difference is your capital gain. Capital gains are taxed much less than anything else, any other form of income. Like in France, which is the opposite of the US in terms of people not wanting to go to financial markets, people being against speculation. In the US, hedge funds are called hedge funds. In France, they're called fonds spéculatifs, right? In France, capital gains are taxed more than other forms of income. In the US, they're taxed a lot less, 60% less, okay? So that gives you already a sense, right? So this is also then a country that drives on asset bubbles all the time, right? And social media is just about propagation of bubbles, ideas and bubbles, right? I mean, I have students that I follow that I just ask them, right? What's the next bubble? How do you, I mean, they're 17, 18, 19, and they're investing and they're making money and they're dreaming to get rich quick and all that. That's their culture, right? So that's a particular type of culture. And that drives that capitalism. Right. I also added that companies are powerful because they have the status as legal persons in ways that other countries do not endow companies with. And I also add to this, which something that I've been completely amazed, is that this is an incredibly corrupt country, America, but it's completely legalized. Right? So literally, companies can pick their politicians, write the laws for the companies, discriminate freely against certain groups in favor of other groups. It's all legal. And part of that is because it's a country of lawyers, and it's a country of legal argument. It's a country of litigation. Everybody sues everybody. Trump has had 3,564 legal proceedings with or against him in his life. Imagine that. That's insane. That's insane. But it's also why people, when he gets convicted, what's the big deal? So yes, it's a very particular type of ultra hyper-capitalist arrangements. So it has this hyper-capitalist economy, but it has a communist economy right in the center, and that's the military-industrial complex, which is basically a communist economy. It has artificial prices, it has monopsony, and it has cartels as companies. I mean, cartels as companies are not necessarily communist, but it has a communist economy within a completely hyper-capitalist economy, okay? And the communist economy is the Pentagon. I mean, remember, the US spends 9 times as much, the US spends on military more than the 9 next countries combined. So the military serves as a social policy instrument. The military serves as a regional development instrument. The military serves as an employment provider of marginalized groups, okay? But the military, above all, is the powerhouse of technological innovation. It has an agency called DARPA, but then it drops the D because it doesn't want to see that it's the Pentagon, ARPA, which is Advanced Research Projects Administration. Just look it up. Go and Google it and see what it does, okay? Before the internet was the internet was the ARPA. It's the US military that set up this global World Wide Web. It's then only when the browser was invented in 1993 that it became accessible to other people. Right? But when I was in the US, I was already a member of the ARPA. Okay? And before it became the internet, I should say my department was. So it does a lot of different types of technology, the military. And it does them by picking companies. Again, it's a very remember, it's a very communist system. Right? It picks companies, then it gives them these contracts called fair return contracts, where they get a guaranteed amount of profits based on their costs. Okay, so there's no competition, there's no limit of demand. You have a monopolistic buyer, you have no competition. You get a fair return contract, and the government basically says, whatever your costs, we give you 17% on top of that. So they have completely free reign to add costs at will, okay, and figure out how to do this as costly as possible in a way, because the more cost, the more profit. Now, this could be very inefficient, but in an area of technological experimentation, this is a gold mine, okay? Because you can do a lot of things, and then write them off, sunk costs, and you go back to try something else. So you have a collection of maybe 500 firms that work with the Pentagon as a major buyer that are allowed to, they're basically underwritten in terms of whatever they want to do, they can do. Then on top of that, the government has research labs. It has maybe 20 really good high-class research labs, right, for different specific types of technologies. It does have a national renewable energy lab, which does actually very interesting stuff for biomass, biofuels, geothermal, whatever, right? Not just solar and wind. We have already mentioned, and Celia, I think you mentioned it, the National Institutes for Health, right? What they do, and they are radically innovative in terms of dealing with innovation in the healthcare sector, and underwriting a lot of that. Right? Then it has this central organization, the National Science Foundation, which basically fills all the gaps that those government labs do not fill. Right? It has these research universities. The American university system has 5 different university systems. You should be very clear about that, right? People don't get that. Okay? There's 5 different types of universities, but one are research universities. They're not teaching universities. People teach something there, but they're mostly graduate programs. We're talking about Caltech or Georgia Tech or MIT. Right? These are basically research institutes grouped together with getting graduate students from all over the world. One of the things that is a strong strength of the US is even today it attracts graduate students from all over the world. So for example, when I just hired somebody in environmental economics at Hofstra, right? I had 176 applicants, 13 of them were Americans. 10 of them were from foreign countries, but not in the US. Okay. Over 150 were graduates, PhD students from Uruguay to Uzbekistan, right? Everywhere in the US. And they usually go through state universities. Right? So you know which state universities have good environmental economics departments. Those are the ones that we're looking at. Right? But it's not just the research universities doing a lot of research, but also organizing an incredible brain drain. Right? Getting really top-notch people from all over the world and making them American. That's a huge strength to have. That's a huge, huge strength to have. And it's also interesting because I know from experience, right? My daughter is chronically ill, so I go to a research university because she's such a complicated case. So there's a research university hospital, and her team is from Argentina and Spain and India and Pakistan working together. India and Pakistan working well together. China, Korea, and there's also a key doctor who's from Ethiopia, and they're all working together. Right? They're young women. They're all working together. Right? And so that I think there's something there that I haven't seen elsewhere. Right? There's a kind of a mingling of different ways of thinking that is having that brain drain come in and then giving them the power to do things is incredibly important to their innovation capacity. Right? The way the government works with business is it just gives them tax breaks. So you should know that research and development, the government pays 25 cents for every dollar by giving them a tax credit. So research and development activity in America, no matter who does it, gets automatically a 25% tax credit. Credit is a dollar for dollar reduction in your taxes. So it's the most powerful tax incentive you have. And the way the government enforces what's research and development is also quite interesting. Okay? And it has a pretty flexible approach to what it classifies as research and development. So there's a lot of stuff you can do. Then Biden has gone beyond that. So he has several pieces of legislation that are quite remarkable, where you have, besides tax cuts, you have massive subsidies in a variety of ways, right? Including tax incentives, but also government contracts, blended financing arrangements, different types of subsidies. And he has this for climate technology, artificial intelligence technology, and then he has a broad, as part of the Science and Chips and Science Act, he has almost $100 billion investment program for new scientific labs and new type of cooperation among companies. Right? So there's a big investment actually in science under Biden, right, in this Chips and Science Act. Talking about Europe. Right, let's do that. So I have 3 slides for Europe, right? First of all, I have the European constraints. Then I have Europe as a supranational governance experiment. And then I have a last slide for specific recent initiatives of the European STI, Science and Technology Innovation Policy. I'm European, right? They have great capacity. I went to the University of Vienna. It's a fantastic university. It's world famous for medicine, all kinds of things, right? Brilliant people there for sure, but they're not entrepreneurs, right? In the US, the most brilliant people in departments become entrepreneurs, right? The university is a business, and the professors can be entrepreneurs. In Europe, that's impossible. And you don't even have the mindset, you don't even have the mindset. So it's not in the culture. It's not in their culture. It's not a risk-taking culture. And you also have a long history, and we already talked to this in my exchange with Elias, right? It has an anti-immigration attitude, okay? And it's long-standing. It's long-standing. When I grew up, I was Hungarian, and I was Jewish too, right? I was constantly beaten up. Okay. One reason why I left, right? And it's still very discriminatory. I mean, my Muslim students in Paris, they tell me terrible stories. Okay? It's a very subtle kind of thing, but there is something very nasty about the cultural mix of Europe that is quite chauvinistic and nationalistic, and it doesn't allow immigrants to thrive like they can in America. It just doesn't. In America, nobody gives a shit about how you speak English. Literally, nobody. I mean, yes, the students will complain that they cannot understand the Chinese professor, right? Because of the accent, right? But even that, it doesn't go anywhere. Right? It's like there's a flexibility about how you speak, okay? Because nobody speaks anything but English. Everybody's allowed to speak English any way which they want. In France, if you don't speak perfect French, you're going to have a problem. I have had problems as a professor there, okay? Because French is my fourth language. It's not really something that I've managed that well. Always very, very tough about this. Right? So this gives me a sense that because it's both anti-immigration, but it's also anti-youth. The youth is supposed to just live with their parents forever because the housing affordability problem is intense in European cities. Okay? Both anti-immigration, anti-youth, and the majority of young people marrying late, not having kids, living with their parents into their 30s, that's very anti-innovation. That's very anti-entrepreneurial, okay? Because the entrepreneurs are young people. And young people who want to get out of there, right? They want to get out of their schools, they want to get out of their homes, they want to become entrepreneurs, not least as a matter of freedom. Okay? And the Europeans don't really allow that, The European companies spend quite a bit less on research and development than other countries, right? The US spends 3.5% of GDP on research and development, the Europeans 2.2%. The Koreans are the highest, they spend 4.9%. So these are significant differences, right? Ultimately, it's, the more you're pushing for European integration, the more you get a backlash of nationalism. This is a constant story between, two levels of the European integration process, right? It goes in cycles and it goes in conflict, right? For example, the Europeans pushed very hard to become the leader in the green transition. The second most important reason why the far right wins across Europe right now is, besides immigration, is the Green Deal. And it's quite concrete, right? In France, they're going to phase out cars. They're going to phase them out. They're not just encouraging electric vehicle like in the US, but they're going to say, this car, category F, 2 years from now, it's gone. It's a crime to drive it. And if you have category D, you have 4 years. After that, it's a crime to drive it. So everything gets categorized, and then everything gets punished based on categories, right? Your buildings, you have to retrofit your buildings, and your buildings get rating F. Then you have to already start heat pumps and this and that and this and that. And the government says, don't worry, pay, you subsidize it later. So there's a backlash for a reason. It's not just like fuck the Greens. It's actually intervening in people's lives, right? And that gets me to the final point about which I have somewhat mixed feelings, right? Because one thing that defines the Europeans as a project in terms of European Union is the fact that they want to be the leader in regulation, in the English word of the word, English meaning of the word. They want to be ahead of the others in terms of having a regulatory framework. And so they have a regulatory framework very ambitious about climate change. They just passed they have a regulatory framework for the internet, so-called Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, just a couple of years ago passed. And a couple of months ago, they passed the Artificial Intelligence Act, even though they don't have any artificial intelligence yet. Right? I'm not trying to make fun of it. I think it's actually quite important, right? But it kind of stifles also, right? It stifles. And it's interesting because they apply these acts mostly against American companies. You know, what motivates them most about these acts are American companies and keeping the American companies at a distance, right? So they're using also their regulatory framework against American companies. Right? And they use their competition policy also in that same fashion, right? But it's also an incredibly important player. And it's not least an incredibly important player because it's an experiment in something that the world may need later on, which is a supranational governance structure to go beyond national governments. And it's an experiment. It's an interesting experiment that actually works. I still think that even though it has lots of issues and lots of going back and forth between nationalism and super regionalism or whatever, it is an experiment in the making. It's an experiment that's unfolding, and it's an experiment that kind of gives us incredibly interesting lessons for a future kind of type of capitalism that's both more communitarian, but also more regulated or better regulated, right? So I have the greatest. I have sympathy for how the European Union has unfolded, and I love teaching that too, right? Because it's a slow process, right? One thing is the key concepts here are subsidiarity, which is at what level of government do you make policy? Local, regional, national, and supranational, and then how you make decisions, qualified majority, okay? The moment you move in Europe from unanimous decision-making to qualified majority, that's when you move it to the European level. Right? And qualified majority is a complex formula. I can talk to you about it later if you want to, but it requires coalitions. And for each particular type of policy push, the European Union has different countries in coalition that are pushing this. Right? So this gives them a flexibility in terms of creating new types of institutions and innovating in terms of policy. And that's potentially very, very strong, right? They also have a constitution. They have constitutional treaties. And the constitutional treaties define both the power and the process and the purpose and the mission of what should be supranational on the European level, on the federal level, right? And science and technology is right in the founding treaty of Rome. It's articles 179 to 190 are all about technology. And the key article is 179, but it defines science and technology in terms of global competitiveness, right? And that's a relatively narrow way of looking at it. So once they decide to move something to the European level and science and technology policy, they decided around 2010 to move it much more strongly to the European level, away from the national level. Then they literally build a governance structure on the European level, right? Which is fascinating. Okay, it's incredibly interesting how they moved education from a national level to the European level, right? or how they're trying to do this with military spending, with the military, for example, right now, right? But they're also doing it with science and technology. And typically, what you do is you have funding mechanisms, you have regulations and directives, and you have institutions that connect the funding mechanisms with the regulations and directives, right? And in a way, European science and technology policy is doing exactly that. What hinders the progress in that regard is the continued emphasis on the national bias. Most Europeans do not think as Europeans. Even the heads of state do not think as Europeans. And those heads of states that think of Europeans eventually going to get punished for exactly that, like Macron or Merkel or some of the Italian leaders, right? Like especially Draghi. And they usually invite very nationalistic responses, right? In their dismemberment, right? So there's this political tension that's always there, right? European leaders get punished, and they get punished in nationalist backlashes. Okay? But besides and beyond that, there's something much deeper that I think is not well elaborated. These are old states, yes? Okay, France and Austria, which are the two states that I know the best, they are both 1,000 years old, more than 1,000 years old. They built not only habits and traditions, but they built a national power structure, okay, an elite that's very organized between civil servants, bankers, and industrialists. On top of that, they have bank-dominated financial systems precisely because they have these triangular elites that are hanging on. Right? Financial markets think of this as a democratization of finance. The banks are not, right? And so you have a financial system that feeds these triangular elites, okay? And those triangular elites are still extremely powerful in different countries, if not in different regions altogether, right? And they organize around national champions. They organize around specific companies that are their vehicles of power, right? And that is impossible to break. So far, it has not been possible to undo this, to break this down. Right? In other words, the federal structure of governance is not strong enough to undo this informal power structure that drives the national governments at their center. So in a way, what the Europeans have been doing in the last 15 years, when they really started putting a European science policy into effect, is to build everything on top of those national power structures. Right? And so usually when the Europeans go towards a European policy from what used to be a nationally determined policy, they make a union. So they have banking union, they have a fiscal union, okay? They have a monetary union, which is the euro as a result. And they also in 2010 launched the Innovation Union, right? Which basically is a harmonization of intellectual property rights, cooperation across borders in research teams. There's a couple of other things I forgot, sorry. But it's the Innovation Union that basically sets up the broad guidelines of this science and technology innovation policy. Right? And so then it has to have a budget. The European budget is very complicated because it's a 7-year budget cycle. Okay? And it gets negotiated incredibly intensely, right? Which is a huge exercise, right? But they have launched two of the 7-year budget cycles already with a high push for financing science and technology, which is new, which they didn't do before, right? The first one was Horizon 2020, and the new one is Horizon Europe, right? Which is a 100 billion euro kind of spending program for science and technology innovation policy, right? Then they set up these cooperation mechanisms for research teams cooperating with each other across borders. One is called the Cooperation in Science and Technology, which is COST, C-O-S-T. And the other one is a much more flexible kind of multifaceted arrangement of European research areas. And you have a network of European research areas. So it's called ERA Net. And, these are relatively new. In 2021, the Europeans, at the beginning of this coming decade, decided to have a sectoral approach also, to specify science and technology priorities based on sectors. And the major important thing within the European governance structure is how they coordinate their science and technology policy with other policies, right? So this has to do with the director generals, right? It's a pretty intricate and crazy thing that only specialists of the European Commission know about, okay? But I know some people who are specialists of the European Commission. It's otherwise totally obscure how it works. But the different DGs, the different director generals work together, right? So they're trying to make a link, for example, between their new federal education policy, which is Erasmus, and their science and technology cooperation policy, which is in a different DG, the DG for research and innovation, and they're trying to work together, right? And that means they're trying to build something like research universities, not as universities, but make universities more like research universities by the kind of master's programs that the European Union finances. And I was part of that. I mean, I know about that because I helped set up EPOC, which is Economic Policies in the Age of Globalization, which was funded by Erasmus, but had as a prerequisite also an innovation part. So we have option A is innovation, and option B is macroeconomics. How that works, you ask me, but it worked on some levels, right? But you also don't just have the DGs working together, you have also some of the other institutions working together, right? So for example, the European Investment Bank, which is a pretty large multilateral bank, has a whole innovation finance part set up, a new part to finance innovation, which in Europe is sorely needed because they don't have the kind of private flux of finance that the Americans have. Thank you.
Very much, Robert. Let's go for the questions. If some of you have questions related to the first part of the presentation. Oh, we have a pending question.
Thank you, Professor, so much for the coherent explanation of very diverse topics. Maybe I had a question, but it was on the previous presentation. You brought up the genocide ongoing in Gaza and the geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. And I was wondering, how do you see the legitimacy of the UN as after failure of the international humanitarian law and international law in general, and as a driver or implementer, someone who implements the SDGs or sustainable development, and who can take the lead after, like, whether this entity will be reshaped with the power restructure, or it will be replaced. I'd love to hear your opinion on that. Maybe my second question is about EU and the US and the different systems. And I see whether, I hope I can frame it well. My country, like or other developing countries, has a hybrid system of the new liberal policy, system of the US and a bit of regulating entity like or social market as the EU. I was wondering, in the transition, like the point you was talking about in the previous session, how developing country can navigate like a transition between after the power structure and to a different system, whether it will be more neoliberal or new social. Love to hear your take on that. Thank you.
Wow. These are big questions. So the UN, look, I mean, I live like 100 meters from the UN building, right? And I have several students of mine working there too, family members from my wife's family. I mean, as a bureaucracy, they're awful, by and large, but they're also underfunded. They are deliberately kept at a tight leash by the Americans and or anybody in the Security Council. And the Security Council is the most important thing in the sense that it's where the conflict resolutions could happen, but are not happening because we already have too much of a conflict between the power centers for that to work well. Right? The UN plays a hugely important role in a lot of different areas like world health, food and agriculture. It monitors, it identifies problems, it gives help, certain, in a very limited way because it's so underfunded. On that level, it's better than nothing, but it's definitely not good enough. And you will have to have, if there's any chance for peace and prosperity evenly spread and more justly distributed, you will have to have a much stronger successor to the United Nations. Right? More like in the relationship of the European Union to the nation states. Right? You do need to have a kind of a global governance mechanism that can make decisions without requiring unanimity, which you will not get. Right? So this qualified majority formula is very interesting. Right? I don't know whether that addresses your question. But the UN plays also an important role as a moral arbiter. In terms of, for example, when it says Israel is committing a genocide, that has an impact, right? It makes it harder for the Israelis to actually, go ahead and pretending that they're not committing a genocide to their own people. Right? I mean, the biggest impact, for example, was within the domestic politics of Israel, right? When the International Court decided to both accuse Hamas as well as Netanyahu's government of genocide. So it does have a moral voice that's not insignificant. How countries like Egypt are positioned, I don't think I want to generalize it. Because a lot of this is geographic location, and then your basic initial resource mix, right? And then your governance structure, right? If you have a military government in Egypt, that's quite different from having a different kind of government, right? Because the military is deeply involved everywhere in running the economy. It's just a way of distributing these power elites that I was talking about, that are differently organized, but similarly powerful in places like America. These elites between, the government officials, the bankers, and the industrialists. I think that the military regime organizes that in a very explicit way. Right? On the other hand, when you take a place like Egypt, the question of sustainable agriculture becomes crucial for a place like that, and that place becomes crucial in showing how to build sustainable agriculture in the period of desertification. In a period where rivers are dying. Right? So Egypt has a particular environmental challenge that's totally enormous, and how it's going to deal with this, and if it deals with it progressively, it's going to be a model for many other countries. Right? So it's true that a place like Egypt has to maneuver, right? And it depends on a lot of different forces, right? In that context, right? So. But it is precisely the unique sets of characteristics that should make us hesitant about deciding which model. I think every country in a democratic way has to find its own way forward towards a more evenly distributed political structure and economic structure. There's
Hi, thanks, Professor. My question is more about the first part of the lecture. I would like to know a little bit more about your idea of how's the income inequality instead of all of this framework. So what's the channel that connects income inequality, economic growth, financialization, and the crisis that we're living? I'd like to know a little bit more about what you think about this. I mean, like income inequality is the root of the crisis. Income inequality is a result of the crisis. That's it.
it's both, and my best way to answer this question, which is a very impractical way of answering it, is that you need to identify different channels of inequality, right? And because it's only then that you understand how inequality changes over time, and it changes more qualitatively than quantitatively. Right? To me, what makes inequality a political issue explosively is the qualitative dimensions of it, right? Which is access to opportunity, right? Or the way incentives get distributed, right, to people, right? So I think it's a pretty complex problem, yes? And we need to have a better, I mean, I very much like the work that is being done, around Tom Piketty and Zuckman and Zanz and all these guys. There's a lot of great work on income inequality, but they too get a sense that it has a lot of different qualitative dimensions, right? And in America, it's confusing because there's this middle class that complains that it's not a middle class, and from a salary point of view, it's not a middle class, but it has these financial investments. And who gets what access to what funds is an important question in America, but nowhere else, right? So, there's also a national differentiation. But I agree that inequality is what makes people angry. And therefore, inequality is what drives both capitalism, creating it, and then its crisis, and then the policy responses that come from the political chaos that comes about in this crisis, right? So it's an ongoing story that's kind of loopy. And because it loops, the qualitative dimensions of inequality are incredibly important and usually ignored because we're just trying to mostly measure. Yes, Rafael. That's your name, right?
Hello. Thank you. Excellent. I really like your both characterizations. Related to the relations of both the US and Europe with Asia. In the case of the US, it's clear that, for example, the complementation with Japan, South Korea, perhaps India is it's clear. But in the case of Europe, how are you seeing this, in particular in Germany and France? Because UK, it could be more in line with the US, but Europe in some issues goes with China and in other. How are you seeing this?
Well, I mean, the manufacturing powerhouses of Europe, right, are very much oriented towards China, both as a market as well as a competitor, right? But that's going to change in a way because there's a sense of, especially with what happened since 22 with the invasion by Russia and then the energy shock, the pandemic, all that. There's a rethinking, but the Europeans themselves don't have a very strong foreign policy approach, right? So when you look at this, is the European having a foreign minister is a relatively recent thing. That's the Constitutional Treaty of Lisbon, 2009. And Josep Borrell, or whoever is the foreign minister, he's just busy flying around containing crises at the periphery edge of the European Union so as not to have more migrants, right? That's his basic number one goal, number two goal, and number three goal, right? So him strategically planning whether we should go with India, or China, and this, that's a national policy, okay? So I would think that the way Europeans relate to the US, I mean, there's a policy dimension on a European level for sure. I mean, like competition policy, attacking the American, high-tech giants. That's clearly an EU level decision, right? But most of what you're talking about is on a national level. And on what's on the European level is their panic about the invasion of Ukraine. There's a profound panic about it. And there's a political polarization to the extent that some of the far-right parties are pro-Putin and some of them are not. So there's also a huge division within the far-right between pro-Russian and pro-European far-right parties. Right? You understand what I'm saying? The AfD in Germany is not the same as the Brothers of Italy and Meloni. Okay, not at all, not at all. Right? So the far-right is actually going to be very fighting with each other a lot, right? They're not an integrated, unified force at all. There's a cost to be nationalistic, which is you're anti-European. It means you're not in a united setting, right? Like some of the other party formations are in Europe, right? So I don't know how to answer your question, okay? Because I don't see an integrated European approach yet towards the other regions.
Professor, thanks again for your presentation. For the second part, I would like to ask a little bit about the EU integration effect, because from what I have been reading, for its citizens, the European Commission says very undemocratic. For example, it's a very far from the common citizen organization. The Europeans doesn't directly vote for for its participants, and well, that creates problems because you're talking of the rebound of nationalism where the European Commission takes some action. So, what in your view would be like a step-to-step solution, at least, or like a vision for the European Commission becoming more democratic?
I don't think that the European Commission doesn't itself become more democratic, okay? Because it's a very, very complicated institution, right? And I'll explain to you in a minute. But what the Europeans are doing, right, in terms of more democracy is twofold. One is the European Parliament becomes more important. The European Parliament has gained more and more powers, right, in terms of checking the Commission and working with national governments and national political party organizations, and then also working with the European Council, which represents national governments. Right? And so, but until now, and this is a crucial moment also in the history of the European Parliament, right? The European Parliament was basically a protest vote. So it actually has had a long history of representation, that it has more crazy non-European parties than national average would indicate, right? Because whenever you have European parliamentary elections, they're different from national parliamentary elections, and then people are just pissed off at the national government sending in the message, and they're voting for Maoists, so they're voting for fascists, explicitly fascist parties, right? So there's that. But at the same time, right, the European Parliament has the center left, center right, that's still holding, and that makes it actually function, right? And so now you have this very strange moment where you have a powerful commissioner, president of the European Commission. She just got reelected, and she has to make all kinds of arrangements with the European Parliament, whose political landscape has become much more complicated for her. And she has to kind of come out of her comfort zone and build a kind of a democratic groundswell against what is most at her heart, which is the Green Deal. Right? She knows that this was a vote against the Green Deal. Right? So this is actually a very interesting moment in the history of the European Union in terms of democratic deficit that we're doing. Right? They have a problem they have to deal with, and I think that politically they can deal with it. the leader of the commission is incredibly important. And she knows, she has a good sense of politics. I don't agree with her at all politically, but I know that she's a very smart politician.
Hello. Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful lecture. It helped me a lot to deepen insights on the US and EU case. My question is about the fact that you mentioned that the European Union can be seen as a supranational national governance experiment.
Yes.
So I can't help but see similarities of this experiment with like our actual global governance. So I wanted to ask you like what are your opinions about like environmental global governance? Because I see a tendency that like countries as an individual, let's say, they're not fully willing to adhere to a common global cause. Like they are aware of the global problem that we all face, but few are willing to comply with the global agenda because like I can also understand each of them have their own individual issues like internally to solve.
Yes.
So I wanted to hear your opinions about our current situation and how it would be better to adjust or make it more inclusive for other countries and power blocks in general. Thank you.
Well, you're talking about the most central question we face. Okay. I think that most politicians and businesses have not yet fully grasped the extent of this crisis. They have not fully grasped the fact that this is an open-ended crisis, and that it's not a human crisis that we can kind of negotiate our way out of. We have to fundamentally and totally change the way we do things, and we have to do it globally. And then the second problem is massive problem of environmental justice, which is that the countries most affected by the problem are the countries that caused it the least, and the countries that created the problem the most are relatively less affected. So there has to be a huge transfer of resources. And not just money, but also technological transfer, knowledge diffusion, and regulatory relief, all kinds of issues, right? So it's like a catch-22 problem, because you need to have a very profound solution that requires a deep governance mechanism already, and you can't deal with this problem unless you have that, right? So, and the problem makes it further and further difficult to do that because it creates more and more tensions, right? But there has to be a conversation among leaders, an open conversation that brings in the public more and more about what we are facing. And to be honest about it, we are facing basically a rearrangement of how the human species can survive embedded in this environment. By having destroyed major parts of the environment and destroying more and more of it, we make certain areas uninhabitable, we make certain crops disappear, we're creating an incredible amount of damage. Right? If, for example, if there's if the global cumulative warming goes above 3 degrees Celsius, my university, which is 5 miles from the ocean, will disappear within decades. And unless people wake up to this fact, the fact that they're facing an open-ended, cumulatively worsening crisis that they can avoid, unless there's that sense of urgency and understanding and shared. Look, humans, when they face subordinate goals, work together, even when they hate each other. Okay? As long as they have something where their problem is bigger than their conflict, they work together. Have always done so. It's in our species. It may be in our DNA. But we have to get to the point where they understand, where we get to the superordinate goal. Okay, we're not there at all. And so this is a matter of politics. It's a matter of dialogue. It's a matter of communication.
Thank you very much, Prof. So this is based on something you mentioned in the first lecture about global alliances and the fact that countries may be forced to pick a side.
Yes.
So I just wanted to know what would be the best way to navigate that. So in countries are in alliances or forms of alliances, especially in cases where there are so much differences in ideology, politically or other ways, but still the partnership makes sense for either economic development or whatever advancing of technology or whatever else. What is the best way to then navigate those alliances, but still maintaining no ideologies, maintaining no independence?
Yes, sure.
But my question is also related because you, in the first part of your presentation, when discussing the possible scenarios for the future, obviously we discuss a lot on what is happening in the US, right? And then obviously last week we were all watching the debate on Thursday, and then we are thinking about what is going to happen in terms of the clashes between the US and China. But then my question is, what role for the global South? You touched in that when talking about Egypt, you mentioned Brazil, but then it's a bit desperate for us to think that, well, we got rid of Bolsonaro in Brazil,
yes,
but then Trump is stepping in again. And then in Europe and in France, so since we are here discussing, and maybe first discuss during the whole, it's a question for us, what role for the global South to avoid the war? What role for the global South to avoid an ecological catastrophe which we can't return? And then what role for us? We have people here from Afghanistan, from Ethiopia, from Egypt, from Brazil, Argentina, and we have to think together what this construction.
Well, you know, if I had the power to just, you know, magic wand, right, I would have the global South get together on its own terms, not in affiliation with any of the conflicting powers. I think it's high time, especially urgently, precisely in this food security, migration, collapsing agriculture, spreading pandemics scenario, that the global South has its own voice and it has its own organization, and it moves that beyond the stupidities of the superpower struggles. I mean, there's a personal dimension to the superpower struggles that is insane. Right? Once politics deteriorates to a certain degree of autocratic demagoguery, it becomes silly in a way. Right? It becomes crazy. Right? And you have that to a clear degree in the US. You may have that in a clear degree in some parts of the European Union. You clearly have that in Russia. And so I think that getting pinned down to make a choice is already a real sign of trouble. Right? The important thing is to not have to make that choice. Right? And then better even would be to have this united front, especially when it comes to how the climate crisis has to be set in terms of the global South is where the crisis becomes a question of unsustainability first, right? And so you have the right to tell the others that what they're doing in copper is not enough, right? You have to have that voice together. The more of you have that voice, the more you will not have war, but you will have reform. I see the global South actually as one of the key vectors of global governance reform that is required. Because neither the Americans, nor the Chinese, nor the Europeans, for each one for their own reason, are at this point willing to do any moves in that direction. But I also think that for many countries in the global South, this becomes an existential question very soon. Very soon.